This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, and welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Lhotka. Today in studio, we have Dr. Matt Springer. Matt is an assistant extension professor of wildlife management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky, and it's a pleasure to have you in studio again today.
Happy to be here.
So before we get started, and we're going to talk about turkeys today, for the listeners who might be new to our show, because you've been on our show several times, so if you don't mind, tell us what you do at UK.
Sure. My role within the department and the College of Ag is twofold. I am the State Wildlife Extension Specialist, so I have responsibilities relating to all of our extension offices throughout the state. And then also, as you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor within the department, so I have a little bit of teaching responsibilities and also research responsibilities.
So today we're going to talk turkey. With Thanksgiving just passed, Matt, could you give us a brief background on why turkeys are a huge hit on Thanksgiving?
Most people believe it started about the time the Pilgrims, right? That first Thanksgiving dinner with the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. That's actually not so true.
Okay.
So I did a little digging prior to the show, and really, turkeys and Thanksgiving actually didn't come together until about the 1800s, the beginning of the century there. So that's when the turkey really started being identified as the food you eat at Thanksgiving. Most likely that first meal is probably something, a mix of whatever they could find and hunt and kill and have on the table at that point in time. So it could be that there were turkeys there, but really that turkey dinner idea started a few hundred years after that.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about turkeys then. What I know there's domesticated turkeys and there's also wild turkeys, I'm hearing from what you've told us.
Sure. So, the thing that's on our plate usually at Thanksgiving is a domesticated variety, and that's to meet the demand. We have about 3.5-4 million birds at a given time. That's one estimate, and recently that estimate was updated to about 6.5 million turkeys. So we've got a lot of actual wild turkeys out there across North America, but to meet the demand of how many Thanksgiving plates, you need a lot more than that. And turkeys are actually a very big conservation success story. Their population dropped, very similar to a lot of our game species after European colonization. They were a species that was used a lot as subsistence, right? So you could eat them. It provide, the same reason why we eat them now. But they also are pretty tightly tied to forested habitats. As expansion occurred, we had a lot of timber coming down to build houses and other things, and they lost a lot of that habitat they really relied on, so their populations crashed. Twofold reasons, right? So the hunting and then also habitat loss. So we actually estimated the population dropped as low as 200,000 birds throughout North America, which, considering that was probably somewhere around the 5 million pre-colonization or more, it was a drastic decline. So they've come a long way. That story, like I said, is a pretty big conservation win for us. And their increase started right about the time post-World War II. We came back. The Depression kicked in, and they were protected in the early 1900s. But with our funding through the Pittman-Robertson Act for wildlife, that money started kicking in, allowing us to do a lot more work related to habitat improvement. And then also one of the biggest things that we did that led to a lot of success was catching them and then relocating them to better areas or areas that were open. So that actually was a huge success in getting those populations to skyrocket. Because if they're in a good habitat, they can get to the good habitat, their populations explode quite quickly.
And can you tell us about the habitat here in Kentucky, what they like here?
Sure, we have a ton of turkeys in Kentucky. We're actually one of the best turkey states in the country. To put that in perspective, European colonization, there was turkeys in about 39 of what we know now states out of 50. Now we have huntable turkey populations in 49 out of 50 states. The only one that doesn't have a huntable population is Alaska.
Wow.
So most of Canada also has them. So they have come a long way. And we actually have a very, very high population that has kind of, it ebbs and flows here recently in some of our areas, but most of the counties have a very good turkey population, especially our forested areas in eastern Kentucky. And then if you go to western Kentucky, there's also pretty strong higher levels of population.
Okay. So in these forested areas, what do they like to eat?
Sure. So a lot of things. Okay. They like acorns for sure, but most of your hard mast is a big food source for them from like right about now, and they rely really heavily on it through winter and into early spring. And then come early spring when things start greening up, they'll start consuming insects. They'll even consume things like snails, salamanders if they catch them. But they'll start going to soft mass. So if you're someone that owns a vineyard, you're not so fond of seeing turkeys. But things like native grapes and blackberries, those kind of things, they'll pick those buds on various tree species. And then, seeds on your sedges, your grasses, they'll consume all of those things.
Oh, I was going to say, so you mentioned the hard mass. What are some examples? You said acorns. Are there other...
Sure, hickory, beech nuts, the ash seeds that we have. But in most places, the turkey diet in the winter will be almost 50% acorns.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're pretty heavily reliant on those to get them through the winter. They'll eat things like hemlock branches and those when they're really stressed. Say there's a lot of snow cover, and they can't get to the acorns. They'll start basically doing anything they can to survive. So their diet is pretty wide, but it can get very particular. They're very good at eating corn after it's on the, so like right about now after the combine comes through, they're good at finding corn in the fields. Sometimes farmers think they actually eat the corn after they plant it. And there's been some research done in Indiana that's shown that's not really true. They're usually picking the insects that are actually probably eating the corn as they plant it.
So they might be helpful.
They were not necessarily found to be helpful, but they weren't hurting.
Okay, well that's good.
Yes. Those are adult turkeys, right? So baby turkeys, your poults, actually have a different set of needs. And they're much more reliant on insect life because they need that higher protein diet to grow real quick. And that way they can deal with elements. They're very vulnerable to cold temperatures when they're small. And then also avoid predators. Grow fast so you can fly.
Yeah.
So what kind of animals hunt turkeys?
So we do.
Except us, right?
Yeah, right. We're one of the major predators. Mammal-wise, we have things like coyotes and bobcats are predators of adults. You get into things such as you may have foxes that can pick off some smaller turkeys. But even a raccoon, if it can catch one, will consume it.
Oh.
We have nest raiders, which are probably the bigger thing in terms of predators that limit the population, where we have possums, skunks, and raccoons, and even get into some of the weasels if they find the nests. Those are a bigger problem than even, say, coyotes and bobcats on the population. They have a few avian predators as well. Great horned owl is a big one. And then some bald eagles will grab them if they get the chance. Golden eagles, but those are pretty much it. A red-tailed hawk, maybe, especially the smaller ones, would potentially prey on them. Obviously, when they're little, about anything that can grab them will eat them.
Right.
It's a much wider array of potential danger.
So they have nests then? They like eggs like chickens? Or
They lay eggs like chickens. So they will either nest in the forest or in grasses or the edge habitat of both. And they'll make a little dust bowl area that the hen will clear out, and she'll start laying eggs over a period of days, so one a day. And their clutch size will vary from 4 to 17 eggs. Wow. So they can have a pretty big clutch, and they do this funny behavior where the hen will actually hang out in an area about a mile or two away from her nest, and every day she runs over, lays an egg, and runs back. So, because she doesn't want to draw attention to them, and she won't start incubating them until she's done laying. So usually about that 10 to 13 is more typical. Younger ones probably lay less than older ones. But once she starts incubating, it's about a 25 to 31 day incubation period. So you hope that they make it through. If, say, something finds the nest and causes them to fail, a raccoon comes along, they will re-nest up to 3 times. So they'll keep trying. So we discourage things like mowing in April, May, June, July, because that's about the time they're nesting. So you may end up coming over top of one of their nests if you have a long grassy field. That's true for all bird species. So.
Okay. And how long do turkeys normally live?
Not long.
Okay.
The hens especially they have a rough life. When you're sitting on a nest and trying to hide it, you are vulnerable to predators. So once they get through that chick phase, which is really where they're the most vulnerable, 2 to 3 years for male turkeys. It's probably dependent on the amount of hunting pressure in the area, but usually they'll get to 2 or 3 years. They can live quite a few years longer than that under ideal circumstances, but in the wild, it's probably closer to 2 to 3 on average.
Okay. What's your average size for a turkey?
Oh, geez. So hens will be somewhere in the 12 to 14 pound range. Adult males can reach upwards of 25 pounds. So they can be hefty. Most of the 2-year-olds will probably be around 18 to 22 pounds, and then you get into the larger birds. And that depends a lot on the winter. So this is based on like hunter harvest.
Right.
So obviously in the winter they're going to be a lot lighter based on how harsh that winter is, and then in the spring summer they're going to be able to bulk up quite a bit. The hens will probably not bulk up too much because they're using a lot of energy to lay eggs.
So your average turkey that, I guess you could say, is on your table, how old is that turkey?
Oh, they're 1 year.
They're 1 year old?
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
They grow them quick.
Okay.
They don't hold too many over. So it's they hold. I can't speak a whole lot to the production system, but I'm guessing they hold some hens over to create eggs for next year to incubate. But they don't waste a lot of time.
Okay.
Feeding them over the winter is expensive.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I know when I was a young child, we lived beside a farm that did turkeys, and they were all white.
Yes.
White feathers. But I noticed the wild turkeys aren't white feathered, are they?
So there's color.
Different colors.
There can be a color phase of like a ghost. It's like a white albino
ghost,
turkey.
okay.
Yeah, that can happen in wild populations.
Oh, okay.
However, if you're a white turkey in the woods, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb.
Right.
Not so great in terms of predator avoidance. So it's not a common thing to have a wild turkey that is white. Usually the appearance that we do see in the ghost turkeys is a very dusty looking bird that still has some color in it. It's not all white bird. Okay. Those chicks probably wouldn't make it very long, unless they're in an area that has snow, which is a different problem. But mostly the domestic birds are white. However, there's a domestic strain that looks like wild turkeys. Okay. And actually, the original recolonization for turkeys, when they were trying to repopulate, they did try to use domesticated turkeys. The states tried to see if that would work, the strain that is looking more like a wild turkey, and it failed miserably. Domesticated animals are not the smartest, and it's a rough life in the wild, so they didn't make it. It was somewhere around, they had collected data, and basically it was something like 3% of the birds that they had let out were actually able to survive a period of time, whereas they did somewhere around 900 releases when they did the same survey of wild birds that they relocated, and about 850 out of the 900 some were successful. So it was a clear indication that this isn't working and we should stop trying to do that. So that's why that capture relocate was so pivotal in terms of turkey restoration.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that they can fly. So great distances, or just
not great distances. They're a big fan of going from height down to the flying just long enough to get them to another spot. So they do roost in trees at night. So they'll fly up to the tree for safety. And then usually they'll fly maybe, that tree may be in the woods and there's a field, up to maybe a couple hundred yards away. They'll fly or coast along that to get to the other side. They can fly across rivers, but they don't, because they're such a large bird and their wing load is high, so their wings aren't actually meant to hold that bird up in the air very long. It's a lot of effort for them to continue to fly. So they are meant for walking. These boots are meant for walking. So that's what they do, and they're equipped in like birds on the ground. They have really good eyesight to help avoid predators, and they like to be in areas they can see. So they don't tend to be in very thick areas very often because it makes them vulnerable to predators because they can't see as well.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. For those of you who may be just joining us, each week towards the beginning of the show, we will play a wildlife sound from the forest. So here's our sound for today. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we will tell you what this animal is and why it makes this sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky, and we've been talking with Dr. Matt Springer, and Matt Springer is an assistant extension professor in wildlife management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. Let's get back to that interview. So for the landowners out there, if they want to attract turkey to their land, what could they do to their land to help?
Sure. So they can do a couple things. Obviously, promoting food sources, your oaks, your hickories, having basically a healthy forest around in that context will aid in promoting turkeys to be around at the very least. Having nesting habitat is kind of key, along with that, not just nesting habitat, but we call it poulting, so bugging habitat, because the poult eat bugs, so we call it bugging habitat. So you need areas where there's a high level of bugs, which is usually like small open fields that they can walk along very easily. And think about it as like a 6-inch little bird that has very, very short legs, has to be able to move through it. Areas that are grasslands, native grasslands that you burn on about 3-year rotation are pretty much perfect for those guys. They have a lot of bugs in them. There's a lot of overhead cover to protect them from potential predators. There's nesting cover for the hens. So those kind of things do help quite a bit. There's a big push to do food plots in wildlife management overall. Typically, food is not a limiting factor for wildlife in Kentucky. So we always like to say a lot of cover, do things that promote cover for the animals. So forested habitat, grasslands, some edge that provide the food that we talked about earlier.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed when you're driving along and you see turkeys, they're always out in an open field. Mm-hmm. So are they looking for the bugs at that point, or depending on what kind of field, I guess?
It depends. It depends on what time of year. So it's a lot easier to show off if you're a male to the girls if you're out in the open, right? Mm-hmm. So in the spring, in March, April, May, that's when they're really starting to try to show off and set up their pecking order because they actually have a hierarchy, a pretty hard hierarchy among both the hens and the males. So they have to set that up, and that'll get challenged every once in a while. So they do that. The males do that through strutting and fighting. The hens will fight as well with each other. So it's a lot easier to show how big and bad you are out in the open than it is, say, in the forest. Mm-hmm. Also, it's a lot harder to see turkeys in the forest as you're driving along rather than the open fields. Right. So, yes, we see them in the open a lot, but there's a couple things that go into that.
Okay. So these groups that you're talking about, how many turkeys might actually be in a group?
A group, flock.
A flock. Yes. Thank you.
So you can see individual turkeys, which is usually what you end up seeing during nesting season. The hens like to be by themselves. Mm-hmm. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. And as their poults hatch and they get older, they'll actually come together and have multiple hens with their poults together, especially when the poults are mobile, right? So the more eyes, the better.
So it's a community taking
It is, yeah. The vigilance, vigilance for predators. The more eyes you have looking, the better off you are. And you're right; those hens may not be related. So it could be, a bunch of different hens from different mothers and everything else, and it may not actually have anything to do with being related to get that gene benefit, right? But we'll also see males will, especially younger males, will stay together their first spring as jakes with the short beards is what they're usually called. That's because they're really getting beat up by the older males. They're not getting a lot of advantage. So if I have three jakes with me and there's one big gobbler, we might all be able to gang up on him. Whereas the gobblers will sometimes be by themselves or they'll be together. It depends. In the winter, though, they all really come back together. And you'll see, depending on where you are, that especially the more north you go, you can see hundreds of turkeys in a flock together in the winter.
Wow.
So I've seen as many as 60 or 70 turkeys in Kentucky since I've been here in one field. So we can see large flocks here even.
Okay. So as a wildlife extension person, what kind of questions do you get from landowners about turkeys?
Sure. A lot of the questions I get relate to the last question you asked me. How do I get more turkeys? Okay. So I've kind of talked about that. Some of the other ones, though, are some wildlife damage with the fruit producers. They're concerned about them. Sometimes I get questions relating to, so they can get a couple diseases. So there's concerns about those diseases. They get some pox on their head that make them look really bad, and that's related to something they can get from aflatoxin poisoning from bad corn. I don't get a ton of turkey questions, honestly, outside of how do I have more. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that nationwide, turkey is the number 2 hunted species, with 2.5 million hunters in North America every year that actually go after turkeys. They're second to deer.
I guess when is hunting season for turkey?
Well, it depends. The one that majority of folks go after is spring turkeys, which is about mid-April to the first week of May in Kentucky. And that's when the males are out there strutting their stuff and gobbling away, and you can call them to you, and it's more appealing to a lot of the hunters that try to call gobblers in. But you also have fall seasons, which I believe this week is the first fall gun season, where you can shoot hens or gobblers, and then about the first week of December is our second one in Kentucky. You're also able to harvest turkeys with your bow from the beginning of bow season, which is September 1st about, all the way through mid-January. So we have a pretty gracious season, and that has a lot to do with the fact that our turkey population is so strong.
So what would, you've given us a lot of great information today, what would be some takeaway items that you would like to leave our listeners with? Sure.
So some of the takeaway items probably have to do with the fact that we have a lot of turkeys. So turkey hunting is not going to hurt our turkey population within Kentucky. It's highly regulated, and we collect a lot of data within wildlife biologists, collect a lot of data. Fish and Wildlife, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife pays a lot of attention to that to manage that population correctly. So hunting is not going to hurt turkeys. The habitat improvements that will help you are having more trees, right? So you need trees around, otherwise they won't have anywhere to roost. So that's a limiting factor in some places. And then, good nesting habitat and good cover habitat really goes a long way in turkey management. And then
I guess having the right kind of tree too, so the acorns they would eat
those. Correct. So having hard mass trees is an added bonus, right? So not only is it roosting habitat, it's also food.
Right.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And then finally, keeping in mind that these guys are one of our major conservation success stories. That they were basically at the brink of extinction. They actually disappeared from 18 of the original 39 states. So we brought them back in those states and added a few more probably where they didn't belong. They are definitely one of our biggest conservation success stories.
Do they help the environment in any way?
So every species plays a role in the environment. They probably have some function in seed dispersal. I can't speak too much to that, but that would be my guess is seed dispersal. And they do scratch the ground up quite a bit, so they may actually aid in helping seed establishment for some species when they do that.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you, Matt, for joining us today. We're always a pleasure to have you here with us.
I'm happy to be here.
So if you'd like more information on what you've heard in today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. This week we have a guest with us from the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. It's one of our wildlife faculty, Steve Price, Associate Professor of Stream and Riparian Ecology, and he's going to talk about this sound you heard earlier.
Okay, now tell us, what was that sound?
Well, that strange sound right there is a sound made by a bullfrog, and it's called its distress call. And it's making this distress call because it's being eaten alive by a northern water snake. Okay, so how these frogs make this call, it's very interesting. They hold their mouth wide open when they do this and let out this scream. And biologists think the reason for these distress calls could include one, the frog could make this call, startle the predator, and then the predator may let that frog go, and the frog lives to see another day.
Right.
Or the frog makes this call, and then it attracts a lot of other predators or other animals to this site, right, where this frog is being consumed. So let's say the water snake's eating the frog makes the call, a fox or a skunk or some other mammal comes over there to check it out. Now that water snake is fearing for its life and think it might be getting eaten, so it lets go of the frog hops away, and maybe everybody's safe after that. So.
Yeah, so it's a way of calling for help,
Right,
basically.
yes, yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and listen to that second sound.
Now tell us what that sound was.
Well, that's a sound that's probably familiar to a lot of Kentuckians. You hear this sound on warm summer nights, and this sound originates from a American bullfrog, which is our largest frog found in Kentucky, and in fact the largest frog native to North America. These frogs call from farm ponds, kind of slow-moving rivers, lakes, other permanent bodies of water. And they'll call during the warmer months, usually starting in late May, and call through about middle of August or so. The males are the ones making the call, and the female bullfrogs find that kind of that deep juggarum sound very attractive, and so they'll move over to the males that are vocalizing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Price, for coming in and doing Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. We greatly appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky. If you have any questions about things that you heard on today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned each Thursday from 10 to 11 a.m. for another edition of From the Woods, Kentucky.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM, and of course via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.